Please consider becoming a member of Poets and Writers if you aren't already, so we can continue offering this programming and creating spectacular profiles of authors, such as the one Destiny wrote about Douglas in our current issue. We will provide a link in the chat to our membership page, and of course, please consider purchasing I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always from your local bookstore or on Wave Books website. A link will be shared in the chat for that as well. Yes, thank you for sharing that book, Douglas. Now, on to the meat and potatoes. In Double Dreaming, Double Imagining, the profile of Douglas Kearney in our May-June issue, and we will drop the link to this feature in the chat as well, Destiny explores Douglas's process of transforming images and texts into dynamic conversations about Black identity, personhood, and art. This is a trickster of a book, Destiny writes, one that requires its reader to pay close attention to what is overt as well as what lurks beneath. I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always is both weighty and whimsical. It plays with and on words, and as Kearney points out, it challenges its own methodology in a way that speaks to the precarious nature of Black life in America, this palimpsest of physical, economic, and existential vulnerability that many Black artists have grappled with and managed to create beauty from since birth. Multifaceted, layered, and expressive, equal parts musical composition, visual masterpiece, and poetry, this collection is full of possibility and expansion, pushing further into Douglas's longtime practices of performance typography, collaging pre-existing media sources to create singular, multiplicitous texts that defy neat categorization. Ken Chen notes that Kearney's prosody is miraculous. Explosive double beats launch the lines or hit the break like a hi-hat. Slant rhymes suggest infinite puns, but Kearney sometimes downshifts from complexity and just cruises around the neighborhood. Now, allow me to formally introduce our esteemed literary guests this evening. Destiny O. Birdsong is a writer whose work has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, Poets and Writers Magazine, African American Review, The Best American Poetry, and elsewhere. She has received support from Cave Canem, Callaloo, Jack Jones Literary Arts, Pink Door, McDowell, the Ragdale Foundation, and Tin House. Her debut poetry collection, Negotiations, was published by Tin House Books in 2020. Her debut novel, Nobody's Magic, was published by Grand Central in 2022. It was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize, was a finalist for the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence, and it won the 2022 Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction. That same year, she was selected as the Hurston Wright Foundation's inaugural writer-in-residence at Rutgers University, Newark, and served as a 2022 to 2024 artist-in-residence at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She is a contributing editor for Poets and Writers magazine and has written phenomenal pieces for us, including profiles of Clint Smith and Roger Reeves, an interview with Mossab Abu Toha, and more. And our featured author this evening is Douglas Kearney. Poet, performer, professor, and librettist, Douglas has published 9 books ranging from poetry to essays. In 2023, Optic Subwoof, a collection of his Bagley Wright lectures, won the Poetry Foundation's Pegasus Prize for Poetry Criticism and the CLMP Firecracker Award for Creative Nonfiction. His 7th, Show, is a Griffin Poetry Prize and Minnesota Book Award winner and a National Book Award, PEN America, and Kingsley Tufts Award finalist. Kearney's most recent collection, I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always, was published with Wave Books this April. Kearney is a Whiting Writers and Foundation for Contemporary Arts Cy Twombly awardee with residencies and fellowships from Cave Canem, the Rauschenberg Foundation, and the McKnight Foundation. He is a Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of English at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Welcome to you both. I am done talking for right now. I'm so excited to witness your collective and individual brilliance this evening, and the floor is yours, Douglas.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, India. I want to thank also Kevin, Marva, and of course, Destiny, who I'll be having the opportunity to chat with again, which was looking forward to that. I had a really great time the first time. And yeah, thank you, folks at Wave. Thank you, Catherine Bresner, Charlie Wright. And thank all of y'all for coming. This is really cool. I'm really excited. So, all right, so one of the interesting things about this book is because it's highly visual, there are only a couple poems in it that I actually feel like I can sort of read, which is an interesting, sort of a thing. Is was kind of like a part of it was a feature, not a bug. Um, Fortunately, one of those poems is the title poem, which is helpful. And what I'll do while I'm reading that is I'll share screen so you can kind of see the page as I'm going. Maybe it'll help uh, like contextualize things a little bit better. I think the only thing that I want to say before I really start, though, is that the title poem, I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always, is the result of a class that I've taught both at the University of Minnesota and my previous institution, Cal Arts, in which students create new poetic forms. And everyone in the class writes one poem from one of the two forms that they write. And this poem, I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always, is the result of the mode of writing by Teo Rivera Dundas called the robot voice poem, in which you write a poem, you put it through a randomizer, you read it, and you put it through a randomizer again. So anyway, so that's all I will say, except for the reading. So thank you all very much. I imagine I've been science fiction always. I've been queried in Ray my nature, then answered why I'm opposite to an objectionable object whipped up as such. To uselessness, I was to wit instrumental, to be played out in the C, a pianola, e.g., I play myself, viz. Vernacular, viz. Literal. It's complex, but this itness needful. Figure me a simple machine. I'd flex some pull, have leverage, could screw with their jive theirness. Yes, lay plain their intention. But complex, what one call equivocation. Smoke, that's lexical, complex, as in got me a complex off of my nature as fixed opposite. Complex, prison, industrial. But is there need some opposite nature to be being complex? One could work janky shit up in that word, complex. They pass off that shit as natural shit. Which shit? Their shit. Their shit. Need my nature opposite. Opposite to what? Yes, dear interlocutor. Where I ain't natural by their uncanny shit. That supernatural, forged as both object and their jury rigged figment. I imagine I've been science fiction always, even as was they done, sailed unidentified, floating obscenities. To whom that natural, sure as shit, it's shady, calling all those tall ships kin, kith. Isn't we forged from the same industry? They pass off that shit as prison too. It's a passage for industrial, but it's lexical, complex. See, a pianola, spry and natural objects, but it's complex. What one complex? Plain and straight their intention. Machine, I flex some pull. Were I forced to answer for my nature? Call me batty, but I aver maybe 50-50 odds you'd find some nature to me. Seems what's in me's too haphazard for blood. It's nature's contingent, which I mean to say, it mess some hands ain't hardly ever blood, rather shit, some register of shit. See it at my feet, running like it can't wait to break north from out me. Right then, right there, it's blood. Thus, I don't guess that shit they spot me with is flesh, yet it sure isn't not. See a pianola, swear I ain't natural prison machine. I flex some blood, never some pull. Rather shit that stop that shit is prison. Other uncanny shit. But industrial, flexible, complex, but complex, what can call, even as complex done, lay plain their intention, and ain't hardly X odds you find some nature objectionable and figure it nature. Me opposite, they spot me with his flesh, were I forced to simple, were I simple forced to an objectionable, I imagine I in science fiction always been, always science fiction. I imagine I've been science fiction. I imagine I've been science fiction. Oh, I imagine science fiction. Always. I imagine I've been science fiction. Always been science fiction. Always imagine fiction. I science. Always. I imagine I've been science fiction. Always. I imagine I've been science fiction. Always. Oh, which then one plan there. Bet to guess equivocation. Fine, I'm done. Then science shit. Sale 50-50 complex. Oh, leverage. Have me done barrel juices and shit. I imagine I've been science fiction. Science fiction. Oh, science fiction. I imagine. I'm science fiction always. I imagine always science fiction. I imagine science fiction always. Science fiction always. I imagine science fiction always. I've been science fiction jury rigged. I've been jury rigged plays. Same machine, never some. I put some blood, a pianola always. Blood and figure opposite. Shit. Me objectionable, me simple, sure as shit is industrial, lexical, complex, that's lexical, complex, like playing their intention, complex, objectionable, mess some heads, and hardly X odds you find some nature. What I X forced to end? What nature? They spot me with this flesh. I have fiction. I've been science fiction. I've been science fiction. I've been science fiction. I've been always I've been science fiction, science fiction. I've been always. E.g., I'll smoke some gas. There has to be that's blood to opposite baddie there. It too obvious. Shit. Equivocation straight off the flesh. What the complex? 50-50 complex. I always with hands, with evening, eventual, natural, figment passes out it. What play nature, 50-50 complex. I'm sure that's complex, could play complex. Objectionable nature, figment. Me, Vince, fiction, always fiction. I'm always fiction. I've been fiction, science. I've been object nature. My fiction. I've been fiction. Other science fiction. Plants. My innate. I imagine fiction, science. Imagine fiction. Uncanny. Imagine. See, but they're natural. Imagine machines. See, I flex and pull blood and never odds off me. Opposite figure nature. Other shit. I force to a simple answer. X. President industrial by their uncanny shit. I play their intention. They've done. Some hands ain't really ain't hardly fiction. I would science fiction industrial. That they toss up that shit out. It is always halfway. I'm trying to EG after me by open. This that sure ain't my opposite daddy. But that's it. I imagine I flex with their play with their narratives. I'm just play with sure that's fiction unstrung. It'd be hot need opposite. I'll be fiction shit. Me fiction instrument. Some force where I a science fiction figure always fiction figure. I swear isn't this where machine or I object some opposite objectionable my nature intention me fiction I could pass as out natural useless as shit. Small, little, check, calling, put, calling, cut, calling, even supernatural. Imagine, Jackie bin, Jackie blood. That's thought, maybe some maybe fiction, needful, some lecture, not like school, complex, life plan their intention, objectionable, lift up, fix, side pick, screw, rather wet, wait, I forced to break complex, it means, sure, shit, such, for industrial, some imagine, Oh wait, oh wait, oh wait, oh wait, oh wait, oh wait. Thank you. Yeah, so that's that one. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, that was a little time. Destiny, you wanna do some chatting or should I read one more thing? What do you think?
Oh my goodness, I want to hear you read more.
Okay, cool.
Um,
Um,
it's interesting because there some of us the sound was glitching a little bit, and we've been in the
oh,
chat
excellent.
debating on whether or not it's intentional because it actually marries really well with your reading.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, I don't know. Do you want to? How do you feel? You want to read some more? Do you want to
yeah.
chat? Okay,
I'll read one more, and then maybe after that, we
yeah,
can chat some. Let me just advance to the one we'll read next. Also, slyly showing off what's in the book, but we're not gonna get into that right
yeah.
now. We're just gonna keep moving. Got to get to the here. Here we go. All right. So this is a poem called Teeth, and there's a couple of things to say about this poem. I wrote the first draft of this. I think literally the last flight I took before the shutdown. I was in LAX and I had just finished doing like maybe I guess a 10 to 12 hour shoot uh, for that very short lived. I don't know if anybody remembers Quibi, QIBI. It was going to be a network that was just for mobile. And they had a program where they were going to like have a poet and professor that was me at that point to talk about song lyrics, not to say, oh well, this song is poetic, but to use a song as a space of kind of like showing poetic terms in action, right? So like there's a Panic at the Disco song, and I was going to be antithesis. There's just like kind of that kind of a thing, and so they had found out about me when I still lived in California, but I had moved to Minnesota by that point, and that's the kind of the second thing that was a really very LA feeling experience that I missed out on because I had moved. But they wanted me to do it, and so what they decided to do is they had me fly out, and I recorded like 12 segments all in that day, and then got dropped off at the airport and wrote this poem, Teeth. And Teeth is dedicated to a lot of the poets who are coming up, like who built so many of their own lanes. I'm talking about people like, organizations like Dark Noise. I'm talking about, you know, um, individual poets like, Justin Philip Reed, Soretta Morgan, um, just so many people, names I'm not gonna remember all now, but just like thinking about all of these poets who write and whose work challenges me, not just in that kind of abstract way of like, oh, new poems, like, but like that I feel takes some of the things that I've kind of taken to just be sort of like the door charge of writing poetry in the US, right? And I've said, what if that's not it? At the same time, I note that for a generation of poets who most of their time in poetry, they've been on social media, they've been recorded. Like it, I can't imagine what it must be to make mistakes and fail sometimes, which I think we all have to do. But to do it when the feeling the stakes are beyond just who happens to be in the room that night. So this poem is for them, and I'll get off of this screen share now because like this is just like you can just kind of mellow sit with that. Chief, what I realized when looking at you, I wished there us is a splitting of certain shadows, and in saying splitting, what they think of, but portioning, schisming, or headaches at figuring a figure out with our non-stop arithmetic thing. You all don't go thinking of them. My bad. My same old. And see, I see you. Yeah, y'all said that. Don't while smiling, which eased me. So your teeth, by looks too, seem like pills. But since you are smiling and I see them all rolled, you ain't swallowed them. The pills that are teeth, they chime together still. That's a figure. I figure if I could have done anything air, maybe I could have swallowed that other them we are to think on and left no nothing for y'all to get as ill. When I'd go correctly, so before y'all, perhaps I wouldn't have spit none of them out even. But now you stopped smiling. So have I, and y'all all. For real though, stop thinking about them. I'm sorry. It takes so much of my mind. I'm sorry. I start instead a story of a speculative physics. So it don't begin once upon a time. No. It goes, what has to happen was, and in this story, shadow don't see light at what must happen for praxis. At this, your lips part some, like a smile soon come back. Only now, no, so many of your teeth missing. No. Yeah, a younger poet I deeply respected and admired, Aziza Barnes. I want to, in some ways, dedicate that to Aziza. But yeah, let's talk, let's chat. I'm feeling all saying.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. And I feel like every time I hear you read, it's like a different experience, but it's always just, I don't know, like I feel like I have to listen to your poetry with my whole body. Because you give it to us with your whole body, which is a really wonderful, wonderful thing. So always an experience. You know what else is an experience though?
What's that?
This cover. Douglas. I almost fell off the porch when I saw this cover. I did not realize that I was looking for a favorite poets and writers cover. No disrespect to anybody else who's ever been on. But this is my favorite now. And also, oh gosh, I love the pose. It's amazing. I was like, I hope the profile lives up to the pictures because
oh my gosh, yeah, no, you did it.
you did the big one. So yeah, for those of you who don't yet have a copy of this issue, you should absolutely get it for the contents, but also for the art. Oh my goodness. So we talked about this a little bit, but before we went live, but I just feel like every time we have a conversation, we've only had two, but every time we've had a conversation, it's always been after this. Yes, thus far. Yeah. Like it's always been like right after this huge cultural moment. And so I want to ask you about Sinners and your response to the film. Like as I was watching it, and we had our recent conversation and you talk so beautifully about the archive and the importance of the archive and the importance of entering it with intention, but also with a desire to like remix it. Like you're not just going there for a dictionary. I think you said that during our interview. It's not just a lexicon or a dictionary. It is a site of memory that you enter into with very specific intentions. And I was thinking about that while watching the movie. I don't even know if I have a question. I just want to know what you think. I just want to pick your brain for a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your response to that film. and what you think about it as a person
Mhm.
who works so intimately with the archive.
No, that's a great question, Destiny. I saw pop up in the chat somebody asking if I could get closer to the mic. Is it better now? Can people hear me all right?
It's good for
Cool.
me, but yeah,
Okay. All
it's
right,
good
cool.
for you.
All right. I'll project a little bit more. So I think that film, first of all, my family, we all went and saw it on just last Sunday. And we were all just like, "Ugh," right? And I think one of the things that just at a most immediate level, my kids were talking about, I have 15-year-old twins, and they were talking about it. And they were just like, and my daughter was saying, like, yeah, there were parts that were, oh, the movie is Sinners. And they were, and my daughter was saying, there were parts that were scary, but I didn't even care because the music was so good. And she was speaking about both the blues music, right? Miles
Mhm.
Catton featured very heavily, but also like the kind of Irish airs as well. So both of my kids were really vibing off of that music, which is at one level a particular kind of archival work. One of the characters, if you kind of do the dating back by what they say in it, the central vampire makes a comment about when he became a vampire, when his land was taken, as an Irish man. So you can tell this is like thousands of years, right? Back if you kind of do the Christian conquest, right? Um, and so there's that kind of archive. There is within the frame of the film the living archive. But I think the part of it that to me felt the most deeply engaged with the archive in ways that feel very resonant with me was the kind of there's an early set piece. If you haven't seen the film yet or read much about it, there's not a whole lot of a spoiler here, but there's a set piece in which there's a musician playing, and inside this juke joint, set in 1932, you start seeing figures from throughout history, some past and some the future for that time and our present, and even I think one figure who might be even future for us, right? And
Mm.
in that space, everyone is kind of engaging and interacting. And there's this aspect of it that's sort of like ghosts and projections, right? Like, ghost of someone that hasn't died yet or even born yet. But they're all interacting, right? And they're all engaged and layering and conscious of each other and not. And so, in a lot of ways, that set piece for me kind of works as a way of thinking about how I engage the archive in making, I
Mm.
imagine, I've been science fiction always. Um, but that, and what I mean by that is, it wasn't for me just going back and grabbing archival work. Um, some of it was, even things that I remembered specifically. Like there's like panels. There's a poem uh, from the collection that uses a speech balloon from a poem that I'm sorry, speech balloon from a comic book that I loved as a kid. And so finding that and drawing that in. But what happened for me, Destiny, is like I would go and I would look, and maybe I would have an idea of a particular image that I wanted to have in one of my poems. And I would go and I would find that image, that source, or I'd find that text from like a book from the 1800s scanned on Google Books. Um, but I wouldn't just take the part that had come for, right? I would read what was happening around it. And that text then would like reinform what I was doing. So I kind of talk about it as like not only a kind of a collaboration with the archive, but it's sort of a structured improvisation with it. And I can show later on, like some examples of process that kind of show specific examples of how this sort of worked. But for me, that was that kind of engagement, sort of constant thinking back, right? Um, Digging into my own memory, and then like using techniques that I associate with like sample based hip hop production, where like a producer is like, what was that track? I remember there was a bass line on a track like this, and going back and getting that, right? But then also going like, I think songs from this era might have had a sound like this. And for me, that was a lot of what was going on. There's tons of stuff collaged in here. And my daughter was asking me about something. What were those chemical? diagram, chemical structures diagram, and I said what they were, and she was like, okay, I was glad they weren't just oxygen. Like I was glad they were something really specific.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yeah, like I would, you know, you never want to say every, right? But pretty much everything that goes in the book at one point, I was looking at it going like, oh, how do you figure the weight of something in gravity?
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that equation, that formula, and that appears in a poem. So I don't necessarily remember all of them now because there were, uh, if not hundreds, 1,000 or so discrete things put into it. But yeah, at the time, everything was sort of like, I'm looking for a specific thing. And that was my kind of archival engagement.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, one of the sequences that I think resonated most with me, and we talked at length about it during our interview, was the Dark
Mm-hmm.
Matter Armory Flex
Yeah, yeah.
series. And we talked about the ways that for me, it sort of reminded me just the
Mm-hmm.
biblical admonitions in the New Testament about putting on the whole armor.
Mm-hmm.
But then also when I go back to it, I think I love it too because it reminds me of my childhood in the 80s and 90s when it felt like I feel like
Mm-hmm.
we have like an online bombardment of things now. But in the 80s and 90s, it was very physical. So you saw
Yeah.
flyers, you saw billboards, you saw things on television, you saw Michael Jackson, and Madonna on soda commercials and all of these things. I just want to know how, I don't know that I ever asked you how that sequence came to be, but if you could just talk a
Mm,
little bit about it. Like you were saying now, like you're sort of looking at each of these pieces.
yeah.
And I don't remember if it was if it was in that sequence or not, but one thing that comes out for me is the police issued I think it was
Mace.
pepper spray, like the
Yeah,
police
yeah,
issued
yeah,
mace. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
That's in this one.
um yeah, like yeah, all of those little bits of all of those little
Mhm.
bits of history sort of coming together in those figures. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So Dark Matter Armory Flex uses essentially the individual components of a Gothic suit of armor, which is for most people, if you're thinking about armor from like sort of like knights, you're looking at Gothic armor. So it's composed of individual pieces. So each piece of the armor, plus a couple of other items, gets its own poem. And the pieces of armor correspond to protecting certain parts of the body. And so the poem mates that piece of armor with a musical, usually musical, but a couple of occasions, sort of rhetorical traditions from the Black diaspora, primarily U.S. American Black folks, but from throughout. And so it pairs a song or rhetorical style with the particular piece of armor. So like there's the field holler, right, which a lot of people see as one of the major progenitors of like blues music. The field holler is associated with the helmet. Jazz is associated with the visor. The music dub is associated with a mask. And that mask, that's where the piece that you're referencing with the police spray can, and I'll share that comes from.
Mhm.
Let me share that real quick. Um, yeah, so you can kind of see it over here. You have the label from a can of mace, um, of the defense spray, which is really
Mhm.
really fascinating. How
Right.
often it's used on people who are already handcuffed or protesters, but it's defense spray. But
Mhm. Mhm.
or zip tied because handcuffs are slow. Um, so for me, these pieces, like, why did I start thinking about these pieces? Well, first, so much of my poetry usually is poetry of mourning or grief, which to me feels like my poetry arrives at the scene of the crime too late. Like I show up and the person's already gone, right? And so I began to imagine what would it be if I were writing poems that were about a person still alive. Let's not grieve and mourn, but let's prepare them. Let's get them ready um, for possible conflict and tension. Visually, the kind of visual set of references that were kind of happening in my head is the work of the artist, the late artist, the Rammellzee. I don't know if many people might know Rammellzee from the 80s, primarily New York. He was a graph writer at first, but he began developing all these theories about graffiti lettering that he called iconic panzerism, Gothic futurity. And he began to imagine that the letter shapes, and this is where it gets really kind of wild and interesting. You can find his iconoclast panzerism manifesto online, right? But he was like saying, like, if you see like an arrow in graph writing, he was like, that's an architectural shape, that's engineering, and you use that to construct a vehicle. So all of his graph writing, he began to think about, he began to think about graph writing as being possibly building tanks, spacecraft, that kind of thing. And he began building these suits of armor that were quoting everything from samurai armor to like new wave style, sunglasses and visors, the kind of things you might see in like an Africa Bambaataa video. But yeah, so he was making these suits of armor. So I was thinking about those and those as kind of collaged pieces of armor. I worked with the visual artist, Chinupa Hansker Luger, for an opera that I worked on called Sweetland. And, when we were conceptualizing the regalia for some of the characters, he began discussing it as a kind of like indigenous futurism. And so in that space, right, all of these kinds of combinations, the collage work of Lorna Simpson, Wangechi Mutu, or Krista Franklin, like all of these sorts of assemblages began to sort of register for me. So I wanted to see what it would be like to get there before the bad thing happened, to kind of like get there before Teeth, the poem Teeth, right? And so that's what those poems, kind of call on for me.
Almost like protection spells, right? That this armor is to keep the subject alive long enough for the poet to get there. That's why that is astounding. I got a few minutes. I'm supposed to leave 10 minutes for questions, but I think I have a little space for a couple more. And one of the things that also came up in our interview is you talked about the success of show, right? And how you often want up show and loved it might think about this book. And so I wanted to give you space to maybe talk a little bit about that. Like, what could you say to that person who's like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I'm ready for this one. Because they should be. I mean, it's an astounding book. And I wouldn't want anyone to feel like it's not accessible to them in some way. We talked about the ways that I read it as a person with like not 20/20 vision and like how I address like, moving across the page. But what would you say to folks who maybe overwhelmed or intimidated by by what this book is offering as opposed to other things that they may have read yours?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I think and that's a really great question. In some ways, I think that the composition in this collection is a culmination of, like for real, like kind of 20 years of trying to think through a specific compositional question. And that compositional question was, how can I reproduce the things that I love about typically sample-based hip hop music on the page? And for years, I was collaging sort of like quotations, right? Or making references. But at one point I realized that like in the legal land of sampling, there's a sample, which is like taking like a pre-recorded, piece of material and then recomposing it and reconfiguring it. But there are other things like replayed elements. So like, Dr. Dre famously didn't sample Leon Haywood's I Want to Do Something Freaky With You. He had a band reproduce it, like replay it. And that to me is what typing like a quote from something is. Like I am rewriting a quote from, I don't know, T.S. Eliot. I'm rewriting a quote from like C.M. Burroughs. I'm rewriting these things. I'm not sampling it. And so I wanted to move into a space where I was really using sort of digital collage of the images of text themselves. There are maybe three, like the title poem, Teeth, and Udder. I think, are the only poems in here that are just like I typed them. The rest of them are literally composed from me finding text, images, schematics, and that kind of a thing. So I say all that to say that at one level, somebody who came and saw a show, right, and now sees this, what I hope they'll experience with me is kind of the sense of like, what does it mean to work towards something for like a really long time and like get to the closest you've ever been to being able to do it to the point where you're really going like, I think this is it. Like there's a part of my mind now that's quieted. Like I'm not lying, right? I think it's also important to note that this is the first book that's come out since I have had my official diagnosis of ADHD. I didn't get my diagnosis of ADHD till 2021. And I'm 51 this year. So I mean, like, in many ways, these poems feel a lot like how I build associative connections in my mind. And I have a colleague at the U named Dr. Jessica Horvath Williams, who does a lot of work with this idea of critical disability studies, neurodivergent hermeneutics, neurodivergent interpretive strategies. And she talks about these five paradigms, excess, accretion, multiplicity, simultaneity, and association. And a lot of our conversations are about how you can use that to read something or interpret something, but I use those to compose something, right? I use those methods to compose. So if you got introduced to my work with Show, and if you read any critical, like critical work about Show, something that most of the critics said in almost every review or analysis, which I loved, it was great, so much generosity, was I said, yeah, he isn't doing the visual poetry this time. Like a lot of people were like, oh, he's not doing that this time. And there was a point in writing Show that I decided I wasn't going to put any of that in it. And for me, right, that was scary as hell. Like, it was like, it was scary, like at an interpersonal level. It's like, this happens to coincide as the first book that came out when I got my new job. Like, it's just, oh, he's trying to get tenure now. Like, what's happening with this? At this kind of personal, anxious, kind of like proleptic level, I'm like, oh, like, what does this book mean? But then it became this sort of game that I was began to play with myself. Where we were sitting there going, like, thinking with the audience, and I was going like, okay, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to hear, some people saying, has he left those kinds of things behind? And I just knew the entire time that I was putting together this book. And in fact, even though I know good and well most people pick up a collection of poetry just open to the middle, I sequenced this book in a specific way so that if you just start reading from the beginning, the first few pages, as y'all might have seen, with I Imagine I'm in Science Fiction Always, looks very just straightforward. But then slowly, as my friend, the designer Steve McCarthy says, instead of bleeding out, the text begins to bleed in from outside. And that begins to sort of layer in. So the last thing I'll say about it, because I've said a lot, I tend to talk a lot. The last thing I'll say is that if you are new to this work in my work or this work anywhere, I'm going to tell you something that is absolutely true. There is no joke. And if necessary, I'll show y'all some receipts. When you look at these poems and your first reaction might be, how do I read them? The biggest difference between, beyond like the sort of process of this book from past poems is I've for a long time written poems that I've said, oh, you can choose where to read them, where you go when you read them. But still, most of those poems kind of started in the upper left-hand corner, kind of ended in the bottom right. There might be ideas that you benefited from having read these up here, and then you get here. And what I tried to do with this book, which was a really interesting process and kind of a rewiring of my brain, was to imagine, what if somebody just read literally one part? What would it be? And so I began trying to work fractally. I began trying to reproduce kind of self-contained nodes within each part of the poem so that you literally could just read here and go wherever you wanted. And that would kind of create this modular sort of approach to reading, where I really do feel like I'm saying you can read it however you want. And I've made that kind of like deal with my audience as a longtime project and part of my writing. So yeah, so really get in there and look for different associations, play around in them. It's like parkour. It's like reading as parkour.
Mm. Yeah, we talked about how I recognized Uncle Tom's Cabin but wasn't sure. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah, like yeah, and I appreciated that because I'm like, oh, I know more than I thought I did approaching this
exactly,
text. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah, yeah. That
exactly.
I feel like I could trust myself a little more reading it again. Yeah. I love that. Um, so we're going to shift to some audience questions. And the first one is along the lines of the archive, does geographical location inform or affect your work?
That's a fantastic question. We talked a little bit about Octavia Butler in the interview. I grew up in Altadena, California, where the Eaton fires were. That's probably our most famous thing now. It's like half of my hometown is gone. It's in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so when I was a kid, when we would drive along Altadena Drive with my grandmother's house, we get radio signals that would like bounce and blend because the foothills were creating this sort of this sort of interference. But what that did for me is like we might be listening to some oldies, and then would jump to talk radio, and then it might jump to like Raza music, or then it would like jump kind of so like I got very used to at the sonic level, like hearing sudden jumps, hearing these cuts. They weren't blends, they were like literally jumps. In my same community, like there was a really large Armenian population. So you might be driving along and you'd suddenly all the signs would be, like in Armenian, sort of Cyrillic writing. And then, Southern California. So you come through a section where a lot of the writing was in Spanish, or there'd be sections where the writing was probably Mandarin. And so at the visual level, beyond just kind of encountering the billboards that I think anybody in a kind of an urban or even semi-urban or suburban space might encounter, because of growing up in Altadena, because of growing up in Altadena, Pasadena, I was constantly seeing different kinds of writing, including graffiti, including, gangbang tags, like that kind of a thing. So region has been really important to me throughout the course of my work, and particularly something that I feel is really central to the way I think about poetics and my own art making is the intersection of entertainment and violence. That's very typical of sort of Hollywood film culture, LA-based hip hop, the myth of the West, right? So all of those things I think are regional and they contribute to that feeling and the way that I'm writing these poems.
Mm. Thank you. The next question is, you mentioned the influence of pop culture. How can we see that with your work, and what does that contribute to the message of your work?
Oh, that's such a great question. I mean, sometimes I think the pop culture is right on the face. Like there's a logo that occurs 3 times in the course of this book. I didn't set down to do that, but I realized I used it, and it's kind of an important logo in Los Angeles vernacular culture. It's the Chuck Taylor All Star
Mm-hmm.
logo, right?
Yeah.
And it gets modified and remixed a little bit in there. But so like sometimes pop culture is like right there, like I recognize that logo. And other times I'm making references like kind of sideways to what the entertainment industry might call intellectual properties, right? Like references towards films that you might be familiar with or characters that you might be familiar with. But what does that do in the work? So on the one hand, if you have work that's doing all of these things that my work is doing, having something that a reader can go like, okay, I recognize that. That's the logo to Atlantic Music. Okay, great. Great. I got something. Thank God there's something I can hold on to. Right. So it provides an anchor at some level. Right. But it also comes with this sort of preloaded sense of what it might mean. I think that one of the reasons why Hollywood loves intellectual property is because they don't necessarily have to build as much audience knowledge because they assume that the audience knows who Superman is. They assume that the audience knows who Batman is. Um, Pop culture, as I said earlier, is also oftentimes where you see this intersection of entertainment and violence. It's also one of the places where we have had the most consistent, I would say, Black presence in US American cultural production and presence. the voices on the radio as pop culture, style as pop culture, slang as popular culture. All of these different sorts of things are like places where Black presence has happened, oftentimes contested, but generally less contested than, say, Black presence in a sundown town, right? So there's this kind of fraught, tense space where pop culture lands. And also, I'm a 90s kid, Generation X, postmodernism, all that kind of stuff. Like the easy kind of postmodernism. But like when you think about the correspondence between T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, right? They were writing in the voices of black-faced characters and minstrel characters, right? Which is fucked up, but it's also the pop culture of their time. So their engagement with pop culture is also a part of this kind of arc that I do feel like I'm a part of as well.
Word. I love that. It's the question that just popped up in the chat. And especially I'm thinking about like your 15-year-old like talking to you about your book. But someone asked, what advice would you give to inspire teen writers? And actually, what advice would you give to inspire us all? Because I'm looking for inspiration where I can find it. But yeah, if you have something to say about that.
I do, actually. So I said earlier, and this is really very true, I've been writing toward this book for 20 years. Like, not, I've been writing 20 years, this book came. No, I've been trying to do what I think this book does for the better part of 20 years, right? And I can honestly say that if 30-year-old Doug, like, saw, like, any of the poems, any of the Armor poems, that 30-year-old Doug would be like, what is that? And contemporary Doug would be like, oh, that's a poem. That's a poem that we wrote. And 30-year-old Doug would be like, why? Like, why did you do that? Like, so all of the steps between then and now, like, I couldn't have jumped from The Black Automaton to I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always. I couldn't have jumped like that. And to a teen writer and other writers like who are pushing towards something, at some level, you have to be willing to believe that your interests, the things that you are interested in, are enough. That it is enough that you want to do and try a particular thing. And it doesn't always mean that you can do it right out the gate. Like, there are skill sets that I literally had to get before I could put this book together. If I look at the first of the Armor poems and then the last revision of the Armor poems, to me, I can see all of the things I learned to do between those two things over the course of like 3 or 4 years. And I'll happily kind of show that. But like your interests are enough, and it's not necessarily going to be the case that it's going to be the first thing you do. So the one on the left, that is the first of the Armor poems. And that is a beat tape cuirass, which is chest and sometimes back armor. So that was the first of those poems, right? The last of them is the one on the right. The one on the right is the most. Oh, actually, I'm not telling the truth. This one on the left is the last revision. That is the most recent one. So I can see ideas developing. I can see technical skill developing. I can see boredom and restlessness going, like, I have to figure out how to keep going and keep making these things. I can see all of that in that process. And that's a really compact process. But to y'all teams out there, like, you can be writing towards something and like spiritually, intellectually, aesthetically eating off that for a really long time before you get there. You have to be able to find something that's going to sustain your interest. And if you started off going like, this is what I want to do, you also have to be ready to be like, yeah, I'm not interested in that anymore. Like, maybe it's the ADHD, but I have no problem like writing a bunch of poems and being like, yeah, I'm good. They did what they needed to do with me writing them. They don't necessarily have to be out in the world in a particular way. And then sometimes years later, unexpected, they come back. But yeah, like, this stuff is, you might have short sprints, but this thing is a marathon. And it can be one of the most amazing runs you could ever have. as you transform and as you change along the way. So trust some of the things that you're interested in and like push towards them, follow them. Court grand failure. That's what I tell my students. Court grand failure.
That's so good because I think we live in a culture where you're told that failure is sort of like the end of things, right? Like you're not supposed to fail. You're supposed to have like you're supposed to be a billionaire at 19. You're supposed to have like a Maserati by the time you're 21. And yes, I mean, just the fact that the work teaches you how to write it over the course of many years, that is so real. Thank you for saying
Yeah.
that. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
We are at our time, but do you have time for one more little question?
Yeah, yeah. And then do I have 30 seconds after that?
Yeah, sure.
Cool,
Well,
cool. One more little question and then 30 seconds.
I'm giving you permission as if I've organized this, but you have my um okay, so the last question, and I think this is a good one to end on because your reading at the beginning was powerful. But the question is, considering the visual aspect of many of your poems, I'm wondering what role voicing your work has in your drafting process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you learn about your more visual poems when you read them aloud?
Okay, so that's one of the great challenges of this book. Like most of the poems in this book, I've never read aloud and probably won't. Um, and I think voice is important to me. To me, voice as a kind of a physical concern in these poems is texture and typeface. Like some of these poems have, 30, 40 different types of writing on them visually. And each one of those things I think has its own texture, which is actually easier for you when you're reading it, looking at it on your own to track that than it is for me to, in a reading, do that. Like to project it, do that. There are physical things that are happening that I think are harder to do. So at some level, I was interested in textuality for a really long time. And then the kind of thing that took me to sampling was texturality. Because the texture of samples that I think is what I love about them. It is the blending of these multiple textures in one place, which is why just replaying it, you could do it, but sometimes it's not as satisfying to me because you don't have this bass line from 1963 in this studio with this equipment and mixed with drums from 1985 with all this. And so I look at that and I kind of think about that as like sample-based music is time travel, right? Going back to Sinners. So voice is very important to me, and visually representing voice has been a long time concern in the work, whether that's like writing phonetically, or using the multiple typefaces, or using logos instead of writing the word Nike, for example. So I think about it a lot, but for me, the most exciting thing is imagining like the DJ set y'all do when you read these books, when you read these poems. Imagining what you put in your head and make happen in there is infinitely more interesting, I think, than what I might do on a random night if I tried to read them. Past poems that have used visual elements that are not quite as collaged, I've read those before. And what I've learned is like, there is a syntax that you can associate with collage. There's a syntax of the cut. And that has made the stuff that when I'm typing a poem, right, like a Microsoft Word style poem, I write sentences now as though they're coming from two different sentences sort of joined together. And that, woo, you start doing stuff like that. I mean, my thesis for my MFA was an opera written in a counterfeit Afro-diasporic language that I created. Like, and so like when I finished that, like when you have to try to invent preposition and just figure out like, what does a preposition do in English? Or what would it do in this culture that I'm inventing? It rewires the way you think of language. And so there is that. I want to share one thing. It's 30 seconds. And what it is, because a lot of times people ask me what the process is. So I'm showing you 12 minutes of screen capture of me composing one of the poems from I Imagine Up in Science Fiction, always a draft, but it's sped up for 30 seconds to take place in 30 seconds. And if there's sound, what you'll hear is a Jay Dilla song working on it. All right, so again, 12 minutes sped up to 30 seconds. Yeah, so that's that.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Douglas, thank you so much for this, for your reading, for this conversation. It is always a pleasure. The two times we have spoken,
Yes, 100%. We're 100%.
it's been a 10 out of 10 experience 100% of the time. So I just want to thank you for that. And yeah, thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom. You are brilliant. I'm wishing you every good thing for this book and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here.
Look, on behalf of Poets and Writers, I want to extend our gratitude to both Douglas Kearney and Destiny Birdsong for joining us over Zoom this evening and moving us with your wide range of thoughtfulness and words of inspiration. From Douglas's fully embodied reimagining of reading as true performance to your well-rounded conversation with Destiny about film, music, engaging the archive, Gothic armor, self-contained nodes, pop culture references, transformation, the syntax of collage. This isn't even all of it, and more, right? So thank you for opening our minds, because this is the necessary work. We will drop once more in the chat a link to where you can easily purchase Douglas's latest poetry collection and work of brilliance, as well as the link to his online feature of Destiny. And additionally, please consider becoming a Poets and Writers member today, which includes a subscription to our magazine. Such a good cover, so I'm just going to show it one more time. Yes. And a slew of other literary goodies. So should you want to continue to support our endeavors and stay in the know on all of our latest editorial offerings, just follow the links in the chat. It's that easy. A round of applause as well for our Zoom audience this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in for us. And good night, everyone. And please be well until we see each other next time. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all. Thank you, Poets and Writers.